Today, I'm very excited to be speaking with Mandisa Thomas. Mandisa, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. Glad to be here.
Thank you. And good Sunday morning to you. Mandisa Thomas, you are a native of New York City and the founder of and president of Black Nonbelievers Incorporated. And I'm just going to give a little bit of an intro for you, if that's all right, a bio.
Yes, that's fine.
And I was reading that although you were never formally indoctrinated into belief, you were heavily exposed to Christianity, Black nationalism, and a bit of Islam. And as a child, you loved reading. You enjoyed the various tales of the gods from different cultures, including Greek and Ghanaian. And though through reading these stories and being taught about other cultures at an early age, you quickly noticed that there were similarities and differences between the deities and the God of the Christian Bible, and you couldn't help but wonder what made this God so special that he warrants such a prevalence in today's society. And you've made appearances pretty much all over the place, CBS, Sunday Morning, CNN, The Humanist, Jet magazines. You've been a guest on podcasts such as The Humanist Hour, Ask an Atheist, and other documentaries. And the list goes on and on of all the things you've been doing. You're very, very busy.
Yes.
Which is great. And I was reading that you recently just won an award called the Harvard Humanist of the Year Award, along with two other people. And I was just wondering if you could start by maybe filling us in on that award and what that was about. And congratulations, by the way. And then maybe fill us in more of what you're all about.
Yes. So, yes, myself, Sakifu Hutchinson, and Ijoma Aluo were the recipients of the annual Harvard Humanist of the Year Award. It's presented every year by the Humanist Chaplaincy at Harvard. And this year it was co-sponsored by the American Humanist Association, of which I serve on the board as well. And so the award recognizes some very prominent humanists that are in the mainstream. And previous winners have been Seth MacFarlane, Ann Druyan from Cosmos, Dr. Anthony Penn, and others. And so, but this year, with there being such, with this year and the climate that has been, the decision was made to honor 3 Black humanist women. Myself, Sakivu Hutchinson, who heads up Black Skeptics Los Angeles, and Ijoma Aluo, who is a #1 best-selling writer. She wrote the book So You Want to Talk About Race. And she also received the American Humanist Association's Feminist of the Year Award in 2018. So and it was also an opportunity to fundraise for Black Nonbelievers and Black Skeptics Los Angeles, because I think this is the first time they've actually honored Black women. And with the current climate, especially of Black Lives Matter, and there being a focus on dismantling institutions of white supremacy, systemic racism, and oppression, they wanted to highlight and give more visibility to our organizations, especially those who are in the secular movement. And so that was an opportunity for that, and
Awesome.
it was an honor. I was very excited about it. Previously, in 2019, I was the Freedom from Religion Foundation's Free Thought Heroine for that year, as well as I received the Secular Student Alliance's Backbone Award. And in 2018, I was named the Unitarian Universalist Humanist Association's Person of the Year. And it's interesting because, I became involved I got involved in the movement in 2011. And from there, it was just busy working, developing the organization. And, in that time, I guess, like you said in the intro, there's been so much done, there's been so much accomplished that now is getting to the point where recognition is coming. And I do appreciate it. It wasn't something that I was looking for, but and I always get nervous when it comes, actually, because it almost feels weird. But it was very, very nice to to receive that honor and recognition, especially along with 2 other very noted and powerful Black humanist women.
That's awesome.
And so, yeah, it was a good opportunity to create more visibility, to gain more support, for us personally and for our organizations. And so, especially in this very, very tumultuous year.
Yeah.
So, we're very, very happy about that.
Yeah. Well, that's awesome. Congratulations. And can you tell me a little bit more about, well, start with a couple things, but just first just tell us more about, apart from what you've been doing work-wise, like tell us more about you and your life.
Yeah. So, like said in the intro, I'm a New York City native, born and raised in Jamaica, Queens. I also am a graduate of the LaGuardia High School of Music and Art and Performing Arts. You think Fame, the TV show, it
Yeah.
was based on that high school.
Hmm.
Um, and so I've moved to the Atlanta, Georgia area with my husband and our daughter in 1997. So I spent half my life in New York and pretty much over half my life here in Georgia.
Yep.
And in that time, in developing and cultivating and raising our family, we really started to just reevaluate, our thoughts on religion and such. And for a while, I pretty much, since I was raised non-religious, definitely, going to church wasn't a thing for me that I felt like I needed. And
Hmm.
so, but as the years went on and we really started to evaluate, and I started to evaluate my thoughts about religion and the church, and pretty much how much and my disdain for it, really. Um, I got acquainted and connected with the secular movement and people who were actually out there, challenging state church separation, and community building efforts amongst atheists. And at that time, I didn't really consider myself fully an atheist yet.
Hmm.
I kind of did when I was a teenager. I was asked if I was an atheist because I was very, very outspoken. I was raised with the Black conscious, Black nationalist mindset, and so I was a pretty outspoken teenager.
Hmm.
And someone asked me if I was an atheist, one of my classmates in high school, and when I asked what that meant, I was told I didn't believe in heaven or hell, and at the time that sounded pretty accurate. But over the years, I resolved myself to being spiritual but not religious. As lofty as that sounded, but as my life developed here in the Atlanta area, and actually seen the overwhelming presence of religion down here. I mean, I don't. It really doesn't matter who you are, but it's especially bad
Yeah.
within the Black community. And
Hmm.
so, it just became important to me to really become solid in my identity, especially as I found more atheists and
Yeah.
non-believers, and in trying to find that community. uh, I found some folks, but it was still very lacking with Black atheists in the Atlanta area.
Hmm.
And so from there, in 2010, I reasserted my identity as an atheist, and then 2011 jumped in, tried to find more community. And once it was seen that there was a need to actually bring out more Black atheists and
Right.
non-believers, that was when the organization was founded. First, locally to Atlanta, but then we expanded, nationwide as we continued to grow and connect with the broader movement. There were people who were interested in starting affiliate groups and similar groups in other cities. So
Hmm.
that's in a nutshell. I said I'm married. I have 3 children. My oldest is 22, and my other children, my boys, my daughter's 22, my boys are 14 and 11. So, I have teenagers now and young adults. And so, and we also have a cat. We have a cat in the house. So, it's just, been doing this along with, working and raising a family. And it's important to note that in 2018, I resigned from my full-time job. I was I was an event services manager at the CDC's conference center at the Roybal campus in Atlanta,
Hmm.
right near Emory. And so while developing the organization, I was still working full-time and raising my family. And as the demand and the requests and the movement increased, it became time to take that on, fully.
Hmm.
And so this is where we are now. After over 20 years of being in the Atlanta area, still here, still growing Black Nonbelievers as an organization, and continuing to connect and grow with the movement. It's seen its ups and downs, but it's always good to connect, with others.
Yeah. Well, I
Mhm.
want to go back to your earlier part of your story in a minute, but just since we're talking about the organization, how hard was it to, I guess, to connect with other people at first? Were there a lot of people that you found that were kind of looking for a group to talk to about some of these issues and to be able to connect, or was it sparse at first, and has it changed where maybe are people more willing to say I'm an atheist than they were previously when you first started? Like, how has the growth been from start to now?
Well, it was always excitement. We connected with a lot of folks who were glad to see that we were there and that there were other Black folks that they could talk to about it.
Hmm.
That was the most important thing, that they were in a space where there were others who could understand, and that they did not have to face questions either about their non-belief and also about what their Blackness was. And so that there's always been, there was always that excitement and enthusiasm since the beginning. Where it got difficult was aligning and connecting with certain folks who, uh, once they got what they needed, they just left, or they went their separate ways. And also, you had some folks who tried to connect who weren't very progressive in other areas. They were anti-LGBTQ, or there was a question of to some members and to some organizers about, well, what it meant to be Black. There's always this conflict within the Black community as well, and also what the focus should be for people instead of just community building and support. There is a lot of advocacy there,
Hmm.
but so we've seen like this turnover of people who get involved and they're excited, but then their intentions aren't always of the best.
Right.
And so that part we've had to manage that part over the years. But
Mm.
there has always been like and I mean, we certainly have had our share of pushback. When we engage the general public, we have we encounter believers who they're confused about why we're here, or some are outright offended and such. But we've also had the opportunity to have some really good conversations with folks, and also collaborate. And so it's really been a mixture. But my one of my main goals and missions is to try to engage people in a way that we can connect on things that we have in common rather than what we completely disagree on. And I think that's the hospitality in me, what I've had to develop. And so once people see us as just being people, then, it makes that engagement a little bit more, more possible.
Mm.
And so, but yes, we have been really, really, we have been really successful in connecting and engaging with folks,
Mm.
either in person and online. Of course, this year we've had to do more virtual events, but we have maintained it's always been a sliding scale, but we've been consistent with our in-person engagement, and that has always generated excitement from people.
That's awesome. And I've, I hope other people have already done this, but in preparation for our interview, I watched a whole bunch of your videos, and I think everyone else that watches them would find them very inspirational. There's a vibrancy, it's like a realness, a clarity that you and your group brings to the atheist community. It's powerful, it's compelling. Um, it's you get the sense that there's momentum growing, but yet it's very down to earth. It's very inviting, and I have a lot of respect for what you're doing. It seems like you're quite a trailblazer, if I can use that word for others, and that's awesome. I wanted to start a little bit by going back to your childhood, and then I want to have some questions about what it's like as an adult
Hmm.
atheist in the Black community. But so, were you raised with were your parents teaching you in a way that was, I know you in the bio it talks about you weren't necessarily indoctrinated with anything, but was there any kind of push to say, you really should believe at least this core set of beliefs about this subject? Or was it very open, like you can pick your own path, here's what these people believe, here's what these people believe, you make up your own choice? How was that for you?
So when it came to religion, that was pretty open.
Okay.
My mother was adamant that my brothers not and I not be raised in the church.
Hmm.
She's very adamant about that.
Do you know
Now
why
my
that was?
well, because actually, my first secular influence was my maternal grandmother and my maternal grandparents. My grandmother was big on celebrating holidays. She was extremely festive, especially Thanksgiving. But the one thing I always noticed was that there was never any prayer. There was never any, compelling, no one was ever compelled to like believe in any God or forced to pray in any way. And I specifically remember Easter as well. It was always about the candy, the Easter bunny, the Easter eggs, and that was always fun. Now, my dad's side of the family is a different story. Now, he himself was forced to go to church and he hated it.
Hmm.
He's more of a passive, I don't care what you believe, just don't try to force it on me. But the rest of his family, including his mother, is extremely religious. And everything revolves around, belief in church and such. But being that we were all raised, in a low income neighborhood in the projects in New York, you can never escape those elements there. And that side of the family was no different. And so I think that for my mother, um, I think that there was, a thing there where she just did not really care for the piety that she saw
Hmm.
in those who went to church and on that side of the family. So,
As if it was a fake piety, that
so
kind of sense.
yes, absolutely.
Hmm.
That was a fake piety.
Gotcha.
And so she, in her and in her mind, she just did not want us being raised in that environment.
Hmm.
And so, but what we were, now she would allow me to go to church with my grandmother if I wanted to, and then I did a couple of times. um, but the one core set of principles that she wanted us to adhere to was everything being Black centered, being
Hmm.
Afrocentric. That our identity would be very, very strong in our Blackness and pride in being Black, pride in our history, being educated and informed about our history, informed about the institutional factors, the institutional oppression and injustice that the Black community has endured,
Hmm.
and other people of color. So there was a lot of education and focus on that. So that was to the point where it was like, it was almost, I would say almost reverse. Like I was almost supposed to hate anything white or Eurocentric, or it was this idea that if you liked a certain thing, that what you like that thing that white people do, so it was almost the opposite effect.
Right.
And so that I would say, and some of it was a bit anti-LGBTQ as well, because as much as I can appreciate that part of my upbringing to an extent, I have to be honest that it wasn't, it definitely wasn't perfect. There were a lot of issues that I take with both my parents because I was raised in a single parent home.
Hmm.
My parents did split when my older brother and I were young. And so, it was not, it was certainly uh, typical of a upbringing in that neighborhood. A
Yeah.
lot of single parent a lot of single parent households, and so. But yes, though the core values that I would say that my mother instilled in me and my brothers was that everything should be Black centered,
Hmm.
and I think that has carried me, a lot of way. Of course, with any form of indoctrination, there are things you have to unlearn about that. But I do think that that has been a sense of strength because especially when you look at the Black community and how ill-informed a lot of people in general are about Black history and culture and a lot of the societal issues, I would say that that was a positive, for my upbringing, to have learned so much
Yeah.
and to have, and to have been made aware of so much as a kid.
Yeah.
And
Now, was
you know,
with your
I'm
mom,
sorry.
was she with her not wanting you to really be pushed into going to church and so forth, was there still any sense of God in the equation, such as like even a higher power kind of God? Like, hey, you better be at least even this like a do good with your life because you don't want to go to hell or you don't want to waste your life, but God's going to judge you. Was there any kind of sense of that behind the scenes for her?
Not in the, fire and brimstone kind of way. It
Okay.
was always, this idea that, there might be a spirit, the spirit of our ancestors or something like that.
Right.
So it was never in like the form of the Christian dogma or the
Right.
religious dogma. Now for a while, we did engage with the 5% community, which is a sect of Islam.
Okay.
So there were some beliefs about, there were some beliefs that, we encountered, about that. But it was never in a way that if you rejected those beliefs that you were somehow condemned to this hell or this,
Mhm.
this damnation or what have you. But
Gotcha.
there was this sense of now my mother did listen to some gospel. There were some, I was raised with a variety of music as well. So I think that was a part of my upbringing, but it still wasn't, pushed this idea that you absolutely had to believe in this God. That wasn't something that was mandatory
Right.
in our home.
So I guess my follow-up question would be then it sounds like from what I know of your story so far, it sounds like you probably didn't have an extremely jolting deconversion per se, where it just you were in it neck deep and then suddenly the cracks appeared, you investigated and you realized there's nothing at the foundation and it crumbled and it kind of shook you. That sounds like that probably wasn't really your experience.
It wasn't that deep of a deconversion. Now, I did have a lot of and I still do. I do have religious influences in my life, and I think the one thing that my mother always wanted us to be scared of was her.
Hmm.
And so, there's always that fear of, your parents. And then, of course, the God, the parent was like the God, right?
Yeah.
So there were aspects of my life in which I was tried to be, that I was raised to fear. But once I did, I think it made it more possible and it made me stronger to not have had that belief in God on top of that. There were times where I felt that, well, maybe there was a God that might condemn me to hell or what have you. I did do the whole what if thing, but it certainly did not carry me. Once I overcame that fear of, my mother or what the parents would do or what the family would do, it wasn't as hard to let go of completely this idea of a God or spirit that was, that was looking over us too. So
Right.
yeah, it wasn't this thing where I absolutely went into a tailspin over it. Although I know there are others who have been, that has been their experience with overcoming and deconverting from their religious beliefs.
Yeah.
But yeah, I just kind of had to loosely let go of all of that. It wasn't, and I do credit the fact that there was a lot of education and information not just at my disposal, but that I was also willing to seek out and learn.
Yeah.
That was, I always had an inquisitive mind, and even if I was cautioned against doing something, I would do it because I realized that it was the other person being scared and not me. They were projecting that. So
Right.
once I was able to navigate that and let that go, yes, things just became so much better.
Hmm. Well, what I know that if this wasn't part of your story, then per se, in the same way that maybe it was for me, I was, radically deconverted in that sense. I was neck deep in it, in conservative evangelical Christianity. Went to Bible college to be a pastor.
Oh boy.
the whole 9 yards. I mean, I was a Bible quizzer, which if anyone's not familiar with that, you literally memorize entire books of the Bible word for word, thousands upon thousands of verses.
Wow.
I've made, physical copy of the Bible. I had, right before my deconversion, I had at least 2 books I was working on. Each one was over 1,000 pages long, and the manuscript, one about the Christian worldview, and the other one is a 1,000-page prayer book. This was real to me, and when I deconverted, it shook my world. But kind of steering it back to what you're working with in your organization, what is it like for someone in the Black community who maybe came at it from a similar background as I did,
Mm-hmm.
who says, you know what, I need to investigate some stuff because I didn't know where this came from. And I'm using Christianity because that's my background, but let's say it was a
Mm-hmm.
different religion too. But so they say, I've always been just told about, Jesus, he's my savior, he's my God, he's the one that gives me the hope, strength, meaning, purpose in life, and certainly the hope of heaven, if not the hope of being able to live victoriously in this life. So someone is all about Jesus, and they suddenly say, I stumbled upon a book or a YouTube video where someone made a claim about Christ, about the origin of Christianity. And I investigated it, and it sounded compelling. It sounded probably accurate. I've got some more work to do, but there's some cracks forming. And just at a very surfacey glance, this doesn't sound right. Something sounds off here, like maybe Christianity isn't what I thought it was. And maybe it is at the core a man-made religion. Maybe it's mythology. And it certainly gives people hope and meaning, but it's still mythology. And so as they dig into that, they're like, you know what? I'm now convinced this is not real. This God is not real. What is it like for a person in the Black community to say, basically, I don't want to believe anymore. I couldn't believe because I know too much now. I know where this came from. I couldn't make myself believe. It no longer seems rational to me. What is that experience like for someone in the Black community, especially when they're surrounded by people for whom this is everything?
I would say it's about the same as what you described.
Hmm.
That experience of deconversion, doing research, perhaps stumbling onto something, the questioning, that is all a part of that journey of a Black atheist. Where it gets more complicated, though, is that understanding that the dynamic of this particular religion, Christianity, and how it was forced on the Black community, how it has become such an overwhelming influence in the Black community, and also how it manipulates and exploits many economically disadvantaged Black folks into supporting this institution that was ultimately responsible for for a lot of the societal and institutional oppressions.
Yeah.
So you have this dynamic of trying to reconcile your own belief, but then also understanding what the institution has ultimately done to the community and how that has played such a huge part in it. And in the ultimately, and you see the, you ultimately, you see the, when it carries over into the societal aspect and how so many Black folks in particular hold on to it so tightly. There's a difference in the church services. They're always much more grandiose. The music, all of the politics, almost everything in the Black community still revolves around, even though there is a history of secularism and free thought and activism within the Black community. That is often completely obscured and ignored. And, it ties into so much as it comes to the high level, the still very high numbers of religiously identified Blacks, especially compared to to the population. Also, how we came to receive this, this religion, which is ultimately the slave religion, which has enslaved other cultures and even a lot of other white people too.
Yeah.
But when you look at the dynamic of the Black community and how so many people still accept it, considering all of these societal factors, it makes it that much more difficult to have that conversation because there's such an emotional tie to the church and to this religion that there is this sense that you are rejecting your Blackness if you reject religion and the God.
Mm.
And so, it's so interwoven because it's been made such a powerful institution within the community that first, there are still an overwhelmingly, high number of believers in the Black community as compared to other communities.
Yeah.
But then two, it also makes it that much more challenging for, to find others as a result. And not because we aren't out there, but because the mindset, of religion, basically conditions you to think that if you leave, then that's it. There's no one else out there like you. There's something bad that's going to happen to you. You're going to be smited. And so, you're going to be walking alone, for forever. And
Yeah.
so it's that, there's a whole bunch of factors that make it that much more difficult, especially when it comes to the visibility of Black atheists, because you see that the overall secular community is still predominantly represented by white people and still by a lot of white males. And so understanding those factors in addition to just the deconversion process and people who are questioning, because there are a lot of folks questioning.
Yeah.
There are a lot more of us. There are a lot more in the Black community than people may realize, but it's a matter of fully coming to that, that conclusion and being open about it.
Yeah.
Especially with all of these societal factors, and actually being comfortable with saying, I'm an atheist. That I don't believe. There's still that extra added stigma and those extra added layers that that just makes it a bit more challenging, to be Black and to openly identify as a non-believer than it would for our white counterparts. But at its core, it's pretty much the same. You question, you've been fully, raised to believe. There are some who were in seminary school, they actually were ministers, and they had those moments. They went through that process as well. But when you come out of it and you understand what the extra added, issues were, wow, it's overwhelming.
Yeah. What would you say, from what you know of, I guess, different research that's being done, does it seem like the percentage of Black non-believers is increasing as far as you know?
Absolutely. And as a matter of fact, there's been some studies done by Pew, which shows that there are a lot of Black millennials and probably Gen Zers that are actually letting go of those traditional beliefs. There are a lot of Black believers who are dissatisfied with the traditional church, because ultimately there has always been this, this underlying idea that if we pray on it, or if we just give it to God, then our problems will go away. Well, don't make any trouble. Even though we have all of these things going against us, just pray and believe, and everything will be all right. And people are tired of that. That is, and when it comes to, when you look at, the civil rights movement and other resistance movements, after a while, the whole, just calm people down and things will go away. That's never worked. If you look through history, there's a history of rebellion and revolts that have had to take place in order for people to get, where they needed to go. And this just isn't within the Black community. We can see this throughout history.
Yeah. Do you find that, like, as people look at the Bible for their inspiration, that some of that maybe gives them a bit of an out for just taking action, in the sense of you become passive and thinking God's going to do it, or maybe, focusing on the Moses Exodus story, the promised land, where it's like, what, just let go, let God. God's got a plan. We're in the desert now for the 40 years, but we're going to the promised land. And I've seen in different aspects of my history where I get the sense that sometimes we just think, what, God is going to do it, So if at the end of the day, things aren't working well, he's got a plan. He's going to work his plan through all this bad stuff. I don't need to necessarily take action because God's working through it. And certainly we're supposed to have a very, the submissiveness of Romans 13 of submit to the authorities who are over you, even if they're really evil. And I've wondered at times if some of the Bible stories give people a bit of a get out of jail free card, so to speak, to say, you know what, I don't have to take action. I can just sit back and rest secure in the knowledge that my God is going to take us to a good place someday. And I don't know if it does it for everybody, but I think at least for some of us, it gives us, or in my case, gave us that freedom to say, I don't have to be that active. I don't have to take this seriously because God's going to take care of it in the end. And who knows, maybe God wants it to be this bad for a while for a bigger purpose. And it's like, once you take God and his purpose out of the equation, you realize if that person that's poor doesn't get help, if that person that's homeless doesn't get help, God's not there to back them up. Like, I need to take action. I mean, do you get that sense at all that that's a dynamic that you've seen?
So there's a couple of things at play here. First, we have to understand that the passages that were enforced during the period of enslavement, legal slavery in this country, was this idea of suffering in this life so that you can get to a heaven in the afterlife.
Yes.
So that there is this, this embodiment of suffering because, you're going to be in the kingdom of heaven. You're never going to have it in this life. You are going to be a slave. God ordained you to be a slave in this life. So, but that will get you to the kingdom of heaven in the afterlife. Those were the passages that the slave masters utilized to condition the enslaved so that there would be no rebellion, although that didn't always work. But for the most part, those were the passages that were, that many of the enslaved were, were basically compelled, to believe. And unfortunately that was passed down.
Yeah. You get that from some of the Negro spirituals as well, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. You do. And some are more like, well, God is going to lead us to the promised land. Now, some of that was taken and interpreted as, well, I'm going to lead the enslaved to the promised land now in this life,
Right.
But they're being led by God's hand. You also have those who felt like God called them, like Nat Turner, for example. There may have been some passages, and he was a slave preacher. There were, he was compelled by God to destroy his enemies, which were the slave masters. And so one could also take that. That's also in the Bible.
Yeah.
So there have been varied things that have been taken from, but I would say for the Black community in overall or in general, it was this idea of, well, I'm going to, even if we suffer in this life, we'll get to the kingdom of heaven once we die. And so therefore, I know my God has me covered no matter what, which has been extremely problematic because not only does that affect the individual, that affects their families. It affects communities, it affects, and so this is why at times it can be very, very difficult, because once someone has that mindset, then yeah, they won't be motivated to do better, or they won't, for the sake of the future, for the sake of, their families, or even for themselves. Right. So yes, it has a serious psychological component. And also this idea, because white supremacy has been so thoroughly infused into that. And you see this idea that, well, these white people are always going to be at the top. They're always going to have, and we'll have nothing. It almost, it almost subconsciously compels you to believe that you don't deserve better.
Yeah.
And so again, which does pass down to generations.
Do you think it's like a behind the scenes, like almost a badge of honor, where it's like the verse that says the first should be last, last should be first? Like, we suffer now, but we're actually in a much better spot in glory. We're at the top, and it's like
For many, yes, absolutely it is. And that is what I find extremely devastating,
Yeah.
this idea that, well, or if I get it, then, screw everybody else, but yes, so I'm going to, manipulate these people who are in this position where they feel like, well, if I'm suffering, then yes, if I know I'll get it in the afterlife, then yeah, I don't mind if I suffer now. And yes, that has been extremely problematic, especially for a community that has already been through a lot and suffered enough,
Yeah.
and still is.
On the note of what you said about the people that are kind of getting the good stuff now, could you, I know you've done this on previous videos, but for anyone who hasn't seen some of that before, could you explain what's behind the concept of being blessed and highly favored and how that's used by certain people to, I guess, put themselves in a better position, and not necessarily saying, and everyone's, obviously we want people to be prosperous, we want people to be happy and to have a good amount of wealth to pass on to the next generations. Great things, nothing wrong with being secure. But how does that concept get misused, in your opinion?
Oh boy, that is one of my least favorite sayings ever. So the idea of being blessed and highly favored, of course, comes from this idea that somehow you are anointed. You have been anointed by God. You are the chosen one, or you are among the chosen ones. It's similar to being, involved in a fraternity or some sort of, VIP club where, you have more exclusive access, and somehow you are of a higher class because you feel like you're closer to God. There are a lot of people who it's similar. It's an oxymoron. I remember one day I was at work, and there was a woman who came to the office where I was. And when someone asked her how she was doing, she said she was blessed and highly favored, but yet she was out of breath because she had had some health issues. And I mean, I don't even think she ran up the stairs, but she was breathing very heavily. And
Mm.
so I think for some people, it's sort of like, a way to psych themselves up, to say, well, I'm blessed and highly favored, even though they're not doing very well at all, but they're still blessed and highly favored because of their belief in their God.
Yeah.
And for some, they feel like, well, if someone else doesn't believe, I believe, so hard, but this person may not believe as hard as I do. So therefore, they're not going to get the blessings that I do.
Right.
It's very, very much just this. It's a very, very selfish idea. It's extremely self-centered. And there are some who may do some, charitable work on behalf of, their churches or, their beliefs, but they think they're doing it because they think they're going to be closer to heaven or to God. So it isn't because they're doing it because it's the right thing to do. It's because, they want to gain favor.
Right.
Or they feel like the more they invest in that belief, the more favored they are.
Right.
And so, again, it's very, very selfish, very self-centered in nature, and it really doesn't take into account a lot of people. And, I do see this in a lot of, circles, especially of Black professional women in the Atlanta area. I mean, it's great that you have made a success of yourself, and that you want to give back to the community in some way. But when you do the whole blessed and highly favored thing, it's just, to me, it's an extreme turnoff. It does make me question what your motives really are
Yeah.
for what you're doing, and anyone who does that.
Yeah. Especially, I would think, is the kind of stereotype cliche pastor that's just, I need a mega $1 million jet, to go around the country or around the world. And
Oh yes, he's
I mean,
certainly blessed and highly favored there, isn't he? Right.
can I ask, one thing that I struggle with a lot is the issue, and I'm going to kind of introduce the subject, but then take it a different direction and come back to the first part. So as a father, I've got 4 kids, 4 little kids, 4 kids under age 6. So we're
Oh
busy,
wow.
busy household. I'm concerned, very deeply concerned, as I'm sure you are too, about the idea of indoctrinating children. We're dealing with, kids basically looking at a mythological worldview as if it was reality. putting them in the fear of hell, the lack of self-esteem. God's always angry at you on some level. Not that you shouldn't still, in the dogma sense, think, Christ is my substitute, he takes care of my sin issue, but you still have this sense of I'm always disappointing God and I'm not holy enough. The codependency sense, it isn't healthy. It's a cop-out for reality. But one of the issues I struggle with, and I want to come back to that indoctrination issue in a minute, but this issue of the church does a lot of good, obviously, for a lot of people, and how to interact in a way with society where we don't try to diminish that or even necessarily take away the good parts. Like, for example, I grew up near Philadelphia, and there was a poor community nearby called Chester, Pennsylvania, and primarily Black community. And I did work a lot with, it's a Christian ministry called World Impact, and specifically there's this little school called Frederick Douglass Christian School. And you go in there, it's 99% Black children, and they love it. You go in there, and I'd go in there to the gymnasium, and I'd have 3 of them jump on my back to play and want to play basketball and so forth. And it was a big difference to kids that otherwise, if that ministry hadn't been there, they might have had a much worse scenario going forward, especially in childhood. And so you don't want to diminish the fact that these groups are doing some good stuff. I mean, some very good stuff in cases. But how do you deal with, encourage that, and yet try to get people to take away the mythology side of it and say, why can't we give someone a free meal without saying, hey, before I give this to you, you have to listen to a sermon. Before I give you help, you got to if you're going to come to our school where we show you some love, you got to acknowledge we're about to tell your kids all about Jesus, whether he's real or not. We're going to make sure they know. And I'm torn at times because it's I've been helped by the church before. The church has helped me, and I don't want to diminish that, but I can't stand. We're basically we've created an entire, thousands of years at this point of generations of people who are absolutely committed to mythology. They're absolutely committed to, we're not going to deal with reality. And if you try to take us even 1 inch off of this being the truth, we're going to ostracize you. We're going to shun you. You're trying to take our kids to hell, for goodness sake, get away from us. And I'm honestly, I don't want to I don't like the word militant, but there's a part of me that leans towards militant atheism in the sense of, I want this to end. I want our society to get over this stuff.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
How do you deal with that as you think through it?
So I lean towards what I personally have always thought that any quote unquote good deeds that are done with the intention to try to recruit or to try to guilt people aren't necessarily good, because ultimately it's like, yes, even though you're helping those poor people, quote unquote, even though you're doing some good works, you're ultimately you're trying to condition them to think that they're always supposed to need this help, that somehow they can't do it on their own, that they're always going to need some sort of God or people who believe in God, to help them. So it becomes this codependency mechanism that that ultimately feeds the church and ultimately feeds that institution. And it's so ironic that the Frederick Douglass School, or what is it the Frederick Douglass School, or was it the Christian school? Okay, I think you're muted there.
I'm sorry, Frederick Douglass Christian School.
It's interesting because he famously said that he prayed and prayed for years until he decided to pray with his legs. So Frederick Douglass, absolutely, he was very, very much against pro-slavery Christianity, which there was, especially back in the 1800s. And I think that educating, offering more resources and outlets for information is going to be what's important. That's what's going to, because the church has been very effective in trying to make people think that they're an absolute good. And history has shown us that isn't the case. Current events show us that isn't the case. But the mindset is so ingrained that there are so many people who believe it. And so there's nothing wrong with questioning an institution that, even if they do good, it's like, yeah, the United States ultimately established some good initiatives, for the Black community, but look at what they did to the Black community. I mean, that's ultimately the least that they could do,
Yeah.
because of what they've done before. So there's nothing, and there are some people who think that critiquing or criticizing is, outright offensive. And it's like, no, that isn't the case here.
Yeah.
Because we have to get to the root of the problem. And unfortunately, the church and, they have been effective in trying to mask their role in a lot of these societal problems.
Yeah.
Because now that they feel like they're trying to fix, because they're a good, because they're doing some good works, but ultimately your institution was responsible for this in the first place.
Yeah.
So it's like, it's about being honest and about saying, yeah, we can acknowledge this part, but we also have to acknowledge this other part.
Yeah.
And then where do you go from here? People should be allowed to have that information and to make up their own mind.
Yeah.
As to whether they want to continue to believe in this or they want to stop.
Yeah. And I completely agree too. The white community, the white Christian community, has done an awful job historically of, to use their phrase, rightly dividing the word of truth. For my college, I mentioned I went to college to be a pastor. My first year was actually at a school in South Carolina in Greenville called Bob Jones University.
Mm-hmm.
I switched after 1 year to a school in Pennsylvania called Lancaster Bible College. But when I was at Bob Jones, you could not interracially date. Because they went back to, I believe, the story of Noah, where his 3 sons had, after the flood, one of the sons had seen or uncovered his father's nakedness when he got drunk. And when Noah was sober again, he put a curse on Ham, and it ended up splitting it. And there was this issue of, and certainly the Tower of Babel came into it as well, with what God has split up with language, don't undo that, which is ironic, because you think, well, doesn't the cross and grace of Christ kind of undo some of the curses? But they would interpret it in a way that would say, no, we got to stay separate. And it was pretty much dogma in the sense of biblical truth. And I didn't find out till a couple of years after I had left that I think one of the George Bush presidents had come to speak, and everyone got in a big uproar, like, how is he speaking at this college that has encoded in its rules of conduct that you can't interracially date, and why is that? And they suddenly changed it. Suddenly God has new rules because of political pressure. And it's like,
right, yes.
But it's like, and I'm sure that's just the tip of the iceberg. I'm sure that's probably even one of the more benign parts of this story. But it does seem like people aren't willing to admit that there's some serious damage that's been done. And I think maybe to put a positive spin on my question for you is to say, what do we need to do to be better partners? I mean, that's where this comes to, really, is how can we partner and, in a sense, be better as humanists than even the Christians are?
Well, I would say that, yes, there are some. It's interesting how, even the Mormons have done it, right? So now, all of a sudden, Mormonism is good for Black people, even though when they got started, they did the whole, curse of Ham thing, and, the darker skinned people were more cursed and such.
Yeah.
So I think that, yes, I think the best way that we can be better atheists and humanists and such is to, continue to connect with those who get it. There are a lot of believers who are very much dissatisfied with what they see going on. And it's okay for us to connect on those common grounds, that it doesn't have to be a continuous fight, there was common ground met during the civil rights movement, because there were certainly humanist leaders during that movement in particular. And so I think how we do is we show that we are better human beings because, we take the education and the history and the science and we implement them in our lives to where it doesn't matter, what your differences are. We are
Yeah.
seeing your humanity. We see the good works that you do. Even if we challenge ourselves and we challenge our religious counterparts on certain things, as we continue to work together, that's not going to be an issue for me. To be a friend to you, especially, or or a collaborator with you, just because you're a believer, unlike what many believers have done to atheists.
Right.
It's like the moment someone finds out you're an atheist, for many of us, the conversation gets shut down. It's like we're automatically, there's condemnation. There's all sorts of things that we face
Yeah.
when so we show that we do better, that we are better human beings by not doing that.
Yeah.
That should that and I have actually come across a number of believers that are like, wow, you're an atheist, but you're and we get that a lot, like, but you're so
Yeah.
nice, you're a good person. Well, yeah, being a good person doesn't mean, being religious doesn't mean you have the monopoly on being good. As a matter of fact, we can see a lot of we know a lot of instances where being religious or being a God-fearing person has shown them to be anything but.
Yeah. And it's an interesting corollary too, that the idea that often atheists know their Bibles better than the Christians do, which I've seen that consistently.
Absolutely.
Can I ask, is talking about these conversations that that we have with people? I'm reminded of a conversation I had with someone when I became an atheist, where I talked to a friend. It was actually a friend I'd had for many years growing up, and her name's Catherine. And I told her about, I investigated the claims of Christianity, and she was, of course, shocked. But, as we all are, no one's really shocked anymore at anything these days. So she wasn't totally shocked, but she's trying to process it. And I said, Catherine, I'm just encouraging you to do the same thing I did, to investigate, where did this stuff come from? And the natural response that a lot of atheists get, the first question is, who hurt you? Why are you so upset? And I'm like, this isn't about that. I mean, yeah, I've been hurt. Everybody's been hurt, but that's not what prompted any of this. I questioned the origin of Christianity, the actual story. And the answer I got was something along these lines, and I'm sure you've had this before. It was, Tim, you can tell me anything you want. You can send me videos. I can read a book. But you know what? I have seen the power of God. I have seen miracles. I have seen answered prayers. I know this exists. There's nothing you could tell me. There's no book you could give me. I know God's real. He's real in my heart. I've seen him move. He's moved the mountains. When you hear that kind of response from people, I guess, number one, do you feel like sometimes you just have to stop and say, you know what, you're just not ready. You're not ready for the conversation. And if you feel like some people are still open in that context, how do you take those kind of conversations to say, let's parse through this step by step? How do you deal with that kind of feedback?
Yeah, so there are some folks that I have encountered who have said, my God is real. I know God is real. He's been there for me, and it is a lot of women. It's an emotional response. It very much is, because there are very few people who are still actually ready to have that conversation. And some of it they may stem from the fact that, they may be scared. There is the fear factor there.
Yeah.
Now I try in times like that. I do tend to, I remember there was a conversation a few years ago where there were some women who were trying to convince me and some others, that God was real. And that God was perfect. I said, well, I said, so, God, everything is perfect in God's eyes, right? And so, but yet there are, because they brought up disabled children, that disabled children are, are God's, they're they're still perfect in God's eyes. And I said, but you can agree that, for disabled children, they're not like others. There are deficiencies that they have. And then they say, yeah, I said, so would you be willing to think that, so perhaps that your God made a mistake?
Hmm.
And so they were like, they were stumped for a second. They were like, well, it was the idea that, okay, well, how is it that this God, was so blessed and did something so good for you, but yet when it came to this other family who probably had no choice in what they had to deal with in their lives, especially if there was a disabled child that was, that was born. And it's like, why would a God put that on them and not you? What made you so special? Is somehow, did they displease him? What was it that? So I try to ask, well, what do you think about this circumstance?
Hmm.
And these people believed, they well, how do you explain that?
Yeah.
And that goes back to what I was saying about people being so self-centered in their perspectives, that sometimes it's like they don't give a damn about anybody else.
Yeah.
Well, I know what I believe, and I know the good that's happening for me. Even if those other people believed and something isn't, well, they must not be believing hard enough. They must not be praying hard enough. And so, sometimes when I'm confronted with that, sometimes I will ask those questions of, well, what do you think about this situation?
Hmm.
And so sometimes sometimes they're compelled to think about, well, I never thought about that before.
It's like taking it really to what some people call street epistemology. Like, how do you know? How
Yes.
do you know that that's real?
Right.
Awesome.
And so,
the whole childhood cancer thing too. I mean, I know a lot of people kind of, cancer has been around for so long and it's such an awful thing, but you go through a pediatric cancer ward, where's God in that? And everyone,
exactly.
God's got a plan. He's taking them to heaven early.
Right, I'm like,
Come on.
Can't. I'm like, I cannot. I refuse to believe in a God that would allow children to suffer like that. I refuse.
Yeah.
I'm like, if you want to believe that, that's fine. But guess what? I would have some serious questions for this God, who would actually allow something like that.
Yeah.
Because there's just no humanly valid reason for it.
Yeah.
and I'm like, you may be scared to question that, but I'm not.
Yeah. Well, speaking of children, could I go back to the subject with you of childhood indoctrination?
Sure.
And abuse. It's amazing to me, but when you talk about this subject with Christians, they almost act like they can't understand what you're talking about, because you say this is abusive, this is harmful. They're like, what are you talking about? We give kids fun songs that give them joy, that put smiles on their face. They have meaning, hope, purpose in their lives. They have love. They're surrounded by community. What abuse are you talking about? And can you tell me what are they missing that they need to hear?
Well, the thing is that, some of those stories that are in the Bible are absolutely horrendous.
Yeah.
Especially the one, now I'm not a Bible scholar, but a few of our members, who were former believers. The story about, there was a Candace Gorham, who is a colleague of mine, and she said she used to actually teach a Sunday school story about the man who was teased by the children, and he prayed to God, and so God sent the lions to eat the children. There was actually a children's story about that.
Yeah, Elisha and the two bears.
Yes, or the bear. Yeah, whatever animal that was sent to horrendously maul these children to death.
Yeah.
And I'm like, are you kidding me? I'm like, those are nightmare stories.
Yeah.
That you are actually conditioning these children to think that if they don't believe in God, or if they don't do the right thing, that this horrendous thing will happen to them.
Yeah.
And you're couching it under, fun songs, and they're being happy and such. It's still abusive. It's still emotionally traumatic. And it's like, that's just one of the things that once you peel back those layers, you realize that, okay, and this is how, when people complain about the media, when they complain about entertainment, about relaying a harmful message under, something that's colorful or a good beat and such. This is what a lot of these churches and these religions do.
Yeah. Well, that's exactly what got me started on my deconversion. I was, as a typical Christian father would, I would be so concerned about my children growing up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord to know the Bible and to love him. And so we would do what we called Bible time every night, where we would read a few verses and then we would sing these songs. And one of them that I've known for my whole life is called Joshua Fought the Battle of Jericho.
Yes.
And it's just a fun kid song. But you look in the scriptures where the song stops telling the story, the very next verses are, they go in and slaughter everybody. And there's other similar stories where they say, go in and slaughter everybody, but hey, you can keep the little girls, the young women that haven't been touched yet by men, you can keep them alive. Well, now we're talking about child brides or worse. What is going on here? And then, do you know, by the way, the YouTube personality named Pine Creek Doug?
No.
He's fantastic. If you ever have time to take a look, he does a lot of critiques where he'll take a pastor maybe that's preaching, and he'll play the video, and it'll stop it every 2 minutes and make comments. It's fantastic. But he brings this one story, word picture, where he says, kind of like going to the Noah flood story. If you had a man that had hurt women, girls, like say he'd raped them and beat them, and then the police catch them. And the judge has got this man who's obviously going to be about to be sentenced to prison or death. And he's got the girls sitting there, they just testified this happened. And the judge, instead of saying, just, I condemn you, the man, to death or prison, I'm going to give the same sentence to you girls too. And the girls are like, we're the victims. That's exactly what Noah's flood is. He said, I'm killing everybody. I'm killing babies. I'm killing nice old grandmas. I'm killing every last person. And it's like, we couch this. You can even go to the grocery store and see these little, Noah and the Ark stories. And you're like, you're not thinking about what you're teaching these kids. You're teaching them genocide, slavery, land theft, racism, misogyny, and the list goes on and on.
It also adds to why and how women are mistreated so terribly in society. And we're conditioned to think that that's a good thing. And it also makes me think of like the original Brothers Grimm tales and how horrific those were, and how there are other people who might be, quick to see how those could possibly, like the Hansel and Gretel story.
Yeah.
It's like, oh my gosh, like this, like the killer of like the killer of children. It's like, wow. But again, with society's conditioning to see religion as this good thing and that you absolutely need it for morality. And it's like, wow, if you look at a lot of these passages in the Bible, there's nothing moral about them at all.
Yeah.
They're absolutely evil. And I think that was something that turned me off even as a kid. And there are some kids who actually do get it. They're like, wait a minute. This doesn't make any sense. We're like, wait a minute. And for some children, they may have been traumatized by this, and they may not have even realized that they were. And it's like, wow, just the mental and the psychological conditioning at times that people don't realize that they're, most well-meaning adults, to give kids some guidance. But it's like, there's no happy, there's no happy ending in any Bible story. Everything is so drastic and it's horrendous, and everything has to have some sort of dastardly price to pay.
Yeah.
And then you wonder why there's such a mindset with so many believers and so many Christians.
Yeah. And that part of that dynamic was really what shook me into deconversion, is realizing, number one, these things were awful, they're awful stories, but number two, realizing, why was I not upset about this before? Like, what was going on in me that let me say, this is okay, this is normal? And then maybe a third similar issue is, you go to the apologists, the Christian apologists, to try to defend this stuff, and they come up with anything they can. They're pulling it. any string and any possible explanation they can to say, oh, it wasn't so bad, it wasn't what you thought. And it's like, it
Right. You're
says
taking it out of
go in.
context.
It's like, go in and slaughter everybody, but keep the little girls. It's like, are you kidding me? And in what sense is that explainable?
To anyone,
Okay,
right,
your God
right,
is psychopathic. He is absolutely psycho. And, he loves people one time, then they do something like they pick up sticks from the Sabbath, stone them. It's like, your
right.
God is a psychopath. And the fact that they want to defend this, to me, is less about the dogma and more about the blindness. It's like, in what way do you not realize you have been completely taken in? You
Yes.
can't even think straight anymore. And that's what
No. Yeah.
boggles my mind.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right about that, and when that, there are many people who probably think, they probably think the same as you or, many of us, but they're scared of losing that community. They
Yeah,
are scared that if they question it, it is like social suicide. You do fear being ostracized because you have gone against the grain,
yeah,
because you're the one who dared question it and question it openly.
right,
So again, that's where the fear comes in, whether or not you, whether or not, and sometimes that fear is couched in like love languages,
yep,
and guilt and manipulation. And it's up to, it's really, it's up to people to realize what that looks like
yeah,
and how manipulative it is and how manipulative it has been. So, there are many people who, want, because there's such a prevalence and there are so many people who are either believe it or they're still going along with it. Once you start questioning it, it's like, uh-oh,
yeah,
there are other real life consequences that can come along with, with doing so.
yeah,
And so,
absolutely.
so many people still get along to go along, even if they realize that there's something wrong
Yeah,
with these teachings.
exactly. Well, this has been awesome. I wanted to take our time to the conclusion by asking about one main final topic, and to try to tie it in towards the end with, again, going back to your organization and what you do. Could you address, for anyone who is not as familiar with it as you are, the misconception that the civil rights movement was started by the church? And I know you've been awesome at bringing in the context of people like W.E. Du Bois, A. Philip Randolph, Bayard Rustin, and just maybe address that issue briefly for people that aren't aware of it or maybe have misconceptions. And then to tie into it, what is the power of free thinking and skepticism, especially in the Black community? Like, what is the power of people like that, thoughts like that, to, people that say, I need God's favor. Oh, no, you don't. I have to go back to the Bible every day to make sense of my life. Oh, no, you don't. What's the power of these people that step away and say, we got a whole new paradigm, the world's changing, and we're part of the team that's going to change it?
Yes, so it's important for people to realize that the civil rights movement was, a culmination of a number of things, right? There were certainly a number of anti-slavery, religious people, like the Quakers, for example, like during slavery. They felt that their gods, compelled them to believe that slavery was wrong.
Mm,
There were certainly a number of, Unitarian Universalists around that time who were involved very much in, anti-slavery efforts. Um, and also too, like we were saying, like we said previously, a number of Black freethinkers, humanists, that has now been documented most recently by Chris Cameron in his book, The History of African American Secularism.
mm,
What's important for people to understand is that the Black community has never been monolithic. It has been, we are just as human as anyone else. As people have tried to shove, there's a saying that for every, for every one idea that has been presented, there has always been someone that rejected it. And that has certainly been the case within the Black community as well.
yeah,
Even with the overwhelmingly high number of believers. Uh, it's important for people to understand that the church has hijacked the legacy of the civil rights movement. And because there has been more of a prevalence of religious leaders involved in the civil rights movement, that there has been license taken, of this idea that, well, it was a religious movement, and it wasn't. It was made up of human beings, some who didn't believe in God at all, who knew that oppressing other human beings was wrong.
Yeah.
And so, I think that because of the overwhelming majority of religious people, that there were some, that there has been too much leeway given. There has just, and also because it was easier to strategize, to go to a church and strategize, as opposed to somewhere else, because of this idea that, well, perhaps the leaders are just lulling their people into inaction,
Yeah.
but or not into violent action, if you will. So it was very much a strategic, a strategizing place, rather than it being this idea that, well, this movement is born in the church,
Right.
so it was more of a utilization than anything else. And the information is out there for anyone to research, if they really, really want to.
Yeah.
What's important about the rise of, especially the rise of free thought, secularism, and non-belief within the Black community, is this the understanding that even though our community isn't completely responsible for our conditions and oppression, we do have the power to take it back. We do have the
Yeah.
power to turn it around, and we don't have to sit and wait on any entity or any deity or anyone else to do it for us. And it doesn't have to be drastic.
Yeah.
There are simple and grassroots means of changing our communities that we can do. And the Black community, and the history of Black community, is one of perseverance. It is one of resilience, and opening your minds past religion helps more people understand that.
Yeah.
You learn about more the freedom fighters. You learn about more people who stood up and fought. Fought for freedom and liberation. You don't just get this lens that, well, we just went to church and prayed on it and somehow God did it. No, you learn about the people who did it.
Yep.
And and expanding that mindset beyond just this one way. There's multiple ways that we can contribute and overcome in the society. We don't all have to do it the same way. And that so it's important for us to realize and understand that that you give that belief that power. It doesn't give it to you. You give it to it. And just as you give it to it, you can take it away and give it back to yourself.
Yep.
And I know for many human beings, no matter who we are, there's a fear in realizing that we are accountable for our lives, and that we are responsible, especially for our loved ones and the people around us. There's fear in that, because you're like, oh my gosh, you feel like there's a burden on your shoulders. And for some of us, who take this on, it can be. But there's power and there's liberation in realizing that once you do it for yourself, that you accomplished it, and that you don't have to attribute it to this entity or this idea that has no basis in evidence. You can continue to improve for yourself. You can continue to improve for your family and your loved ones, and just for people in general. And that we absolutely can do it. And that is what is much more, that is so powerful, more than anything else, is realizing that we have the means, to do it, and to do it for ourselves.
Yeah.
And as well as helping others.
Yeah, and that's a couple of thoughts come to mind. It's ironic, as you were talking about the people that were kind of the power behind some of these changes back or in earlier generations, that it strikes me that they had a morality that was better than the morality of the Bible's God. Like, you can literally, as someone else has said, you literally can like just add one sentence to the Bible, and your morality is better than God, such as don't own people. Like,
Right.
just add that to scripture,
Right.
don't own people, and
Right.
it made the Bible better. And yet, your God can't do that. He can talk about don't eat shellfish and don't mix together two different kinds of fabric, but you can own people. In fact, you can beat them to the, till they're almost dead, and you can bequeath them to your children as inheritances. But he can't say, don't own people. How in the world can our morality be instantly better than God's? And doesn't that cause some people a reason to pause? And the other thing I feel like I get from almost every answer you've given is just, you seem so hopeful. This world is obviously going through a dark time in a lot of ways. And I hear you loud and clear saying, yeah, there's some big issues. So let's get to work. How are we going to fix it? And
right.
It's like there's nothing to go from our vantage point. There's nowhere to go from here but up. Like, let's fix the problem, and hopefully let's fix it without this mythology that's keeping people confused. And I know for me, I don't know if other atheists feel this way, but I feel like one of the biggest motivations is just when I got out, people were like, how do you have peace and joy? I was like, I have so much peace in my heart.
Yes.
And they're like, how? And I'm like, well, I just took the blinders off for the first time. I just got my real life started at age 43. I just started living for the first time. There's a peace in realizing you were in a cult and you just escaped, and you never, if apart from the chips falling certain ways, you would have never started living your life for a single day. It's like that movie The Matrix where Neo is, remember where Morpheus is working on Neo, and Neo's like, why do my eyes hurt? He's like, you've never used your eyes before. It's like, that's just a freedom and a power and a joy in that. And I love that. I love that you're so hopeful about making a difference.
Yes, actually, one of our members gave me the nickname of Morpheus, which I always thought that was kind of funny. But, that is often where, I totally understand and I resonate with that because, I had to realize that there was a power that I had as an individual and as a human being that, that I could utilize,
Yeah.
Especially in turning around certain personal circumstances. I realized that it wasn't going to be up to anyone else to do. It was up to me. And I always enjoyed philosophies, even when I was like loosely spiritual. I always enjoy philosophies that encouraged looking within and finding that inner strength. Because oftentimes we are not encouraged to do that. It's always that you have to look to this outside entity. And I absolutely could never stand any ideology that encouraged, giving up that sense of your agency, that you have to give up your agency. You have to give up a part of yourself and you have to submit. And I'm like, wait a minute, there's something wrong with that. And, I think that, yes, as we lose our religions and then there's nothing, and I think that it's okay to be realistic, that there are times where you don't have to be like, you don't have to have the, you don't have to show that toxic positivity. Oh, everything's going to be okay. No, there are times where everything is just going to be crappy, but, we
like 2020.
ultimately, right. Yes. But you ultimately can change that around, and it's okay. And that's also a byproduct of blind religious belief, is saying that, oh, well, things are bad, but God's going to handle it. My day is still good. No. There are times where things are so bad, but that means that you have to fix it, or that there are times where even if they're bad, there's something you can do about it. Once you vent about it, once you cry, once you scream, you are clear to do something about it if you can. And so, I realized that and it's probably due to the work that I do as well. I've always been a hands-on person. I've always been I know I'm not just going to rely on someone to do this for me. I'm going to try to do it myself. And so in having that, and I've realized that not everyone has that, or they have to develop it. But when you realize that there are things you can do and you don't have to wait on anybody else, and you just do it like the Nike slogan, it gives you a bit more optimism, that, and when I have connected with so many people who are doing that work, and it's inspirational to me. It's inspirational to see how they do it, and also that they can live their lives. There's this idea that you have to live your life solely for the servitude of others, that you cannot enjoy your life in any way. And that is something that I absolutely disagree with.
Yeah.
Because there are a number of religious people who have just given their lives to, this belief in God, or this belief, that this idea of servitude, that they don't have the chance to, to develop themselves, or to feel liberated in themselves. And I am totally dedicated to helping people understand that they can do that for themselves. Even if they continue to do things for others, do for yourself first. Don't kill yourself
Right.
doing for other people. And unfortunately, that has often been at the backbone, especially of Black women, that we are expected to be that foundation for so many other people, while killing ourselves in the process, and without the credit and the respect that we deserve. And it's time to turn that around. So
Yeah.
and yes, I find myself being very optimistic about that, because I've had to do it. And if I've had to do it, and I've seen other people do it, there's evidence that it works.
Yeah.
There's evidence that it can happen. And so that is what makes me optimistic, and have a better outlook, because I don't have that sense of, that dogmatic feeling all the time, that that I absolutely have to resolve myself to doom and gloom. So yeah, it's so liberating.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is. Yes. It's hard for people, I think, on the outside, or who are, I should say, stuck on the inside of what I call the Bible prison. It's hard for them to see the other side, but it's like, once you realize that there's a whole different reality that you now get to embrace and discover for the first time, and you get to understand your place in it. Even from if you were stuck in the idea of creationism, all of a sudden, like, okay, evolution was part of the story. You get to realize, science for the first time, and to realize how this world came to be where it is today. And there's a joy that just comes in realizing, I didn't really know myself before. And now you're like, okay, now that I'm free of this pretend God, free
Yeah.
of mythology as my core worldview, now I'm free to actually say, who am I? And that's
Right.
an adventure. It's a joy.
It also opens you up to what's going on in the world.
Yes.
It makes you less passive about, about what's going on with people, with the human condition.
Yeah.
And it can be an eye opener. It can be a bit scary, but really it's it has awakened. It has more people, it causes more people to be, woke, if you will. Because once you realize what's going on, in the world, and it's like, and you go beyond that world view of, well, God is going to handle everything, you realize that it's like, oh my gosh, these things are terrible. There's something we have to do about this.
Yeah.
I've talked to plenty of other white people as well, who realize that, wow, they were so blinded and oblivious to, to the racism in the world, and how
Yep.
that has, and like you said, in white evangelical circles, how they have perpetuated this, how bad this has been. And they don't, when they come out of it, they realize, wow, this religion that I was raised with really has been responsible for some really bad stuff in the world, and
Yeah.
how I may have treated people who were different. And so it really, really awakens something, in people. And you find that, and then that's where I also, when I go back to my childhood, and I was raised with the awareness of what was going on. I didn't have those religious blinders on me, to say, well, there was some divine plan that God concocted for this. No, no, absolutely not. So I think it, whether you were born with it, or whether you came to it later on in life, you realize that your mind and your world becomes more open.
Yeah. Absolutely. And what a great thing too, with all the energy that we all, especially former Christians, all the energy that we would have given, all the money, all the time, the energy to spread the gospel, to suddenly turn that more towards a healthy humanism, and to say, let's actually do the real work. Now let's get to work and make a difference. And what a great thing. Mandisa, I'm amazed, I'm impressed, I'm inspired. And I will admit, readily, just as both as from my background, and even in the last year as someone that has just escaped Christianity,
Yep.
I am not as educated as I need to be. And I take it as a challenge and an inspiration to be more educated, to be more connected with your group and other groups like it, to say, you know, we have a job to do, and both in terms as atheists, but more importantly as humanists, to improve our world. For you know, this is the only life we get. We're not
Right.
looking to make it through and then get to the real life. This is it. We want to give our kids a better world than what we had when we found it. And I will definitely be becoming more educated. And again, it's to my shame, I should say, I did not, till I heard you share in some of your videos, I did not know who W.E. Du Bois was, or A. Philip Randolph, or Bayard Rustin. And I'm going to become educated. I'm going to learn more about the history of that. And I think it's the challenge we all need to take, is to be more educated about everybody that's different and that has a different story, and to realize we have been given some party lines that we need to think past.
Absolutely. And then when you see, many white atheists and humanists ask, well, why does there need to be an organization called Black Nonbelievers? And they don't know this information. They weren't aware of, the contributions that, Black humanists and freethinkers have made. There is a need for our organizations to reshape that narrative,
Yes.
to disrupt it, of this idea that it is simply, there are the voices of humanism are simply white men, and that could be further from the truth. And so, yes, this is one of the reasons why our organization exists, because, and it's like, there's no shame in not knowing before, but continuing to not know is where the shame comes in. So,
Yes.
and this is why we do what we do, not just to increase our demographic, but again, to provide and to offer that information that people weren't aware of before.
Yeah, absolutely. And for anyone who wants more information, your website is blacknonbelievers.org. It's also right behind Mandisa on the
Yes,
background.
absolutely. And
And
it reroutes to .com for anyone that is confused, but we're still a .org.
okay,
We're a nonprofit organization, so yes.
great. And I'll put that in the link below the video. And I just wanted to say, in conclusion, I hope that your voice and your platform just gets more of an audience than ever. And I hope that our partnerships as atheists get stronger. I think we can do a lot of really good stuff together. And I am, to borrow the word we used before, I'm blessed to get to know you.
Thank you.
Uh,
Yes.
and I'm just, it's awesome. And I hope that what you're doing expands even beyond your wildest dreams. So thank you for joining me, and I hope we can do it again sometime.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me once again.
Thank you, Mandisa.